just what you have to do when a queen decides she's going to pop in to see you. And not just any old queen, Victoria.
Like a pair of obsessed Victoria groupies, we're pursuing her around the country to the posh pads she visited. We'll be delving into her personal diaries and first-hand accounts to reveal what went on behind closed doors.
Today, Hughenden Manor, home to Benjamin Disraeli, British Prime Minister, when Victoria came and visited just before Christmas in 1877.
But it was no ordinary social call. Oh no, the Queen had urgent political business in mind.
And as someone who's spent a lifetime getting excited by antiques, I'll be upstairs exploring the wonderful gifts that Victoria showered on her host.
He would have felt completely chuffed.
And as a chef who's passionate about the best British food, I'll be making a 19th century cake with a boozy finish in honour of Victoria's favourite PM. That looks wonderful. And it packs a real punch for Tim.
Pretty alco pop, this, isn't it?
The year is 1877. Queen Victoria is a 58-year-old widow and has been on the throne for a hefty 40 years. This was her first ever trip to the home of Benjamin Disraeli, who was in his third year as Prime Minister. Victoria travelled from Windsor to High Wycombe on the Royal Train, a journey that took just 35 minutes.
The Queen arrived at Hughenden accompanied by her youngest daughter, Beatrice. They got out of the train at High Wycombe station and were transferred to a horse and carriage which ultimately swept them through this gateway up to the house, Benjamin Disraeli's country seat.
And this is on a much lesser scale to the grand estates that Victoria was used to. But the grounds were cleverly designed to hide the house from view.
Just as well, because both Victoria and the Prime Minister required a bit of privacy. You see, this trip was all a bit serious, because at the time there was an international crisis. Russia was at war with Turkey, putting at risk vital trade routes to India, and Victoria was having none of it. She wanted the Prime Minister to declare war on Russia in order to quash the threat. But even with all this going on, Disraeli still wanted to put on a good show for the Queen.
Victoria's visit here to Hughenden would have been seen by Disraeli as an absolute triumph, because he was, after all, the ultimate social climber. The fact that his sovereign was going to call would have driven him into a complete ecstasy, even though she only came for lunch. Now, the house may not be as imposing as some, but they did try their very best to make sure that it would impress for the Queen.
And I'm actually going to find out if they were working just as hard to impress below stairs.
And I'm going to find out some more about this intriguing house.
This visit was strictly business, but in later years Victoria grew incredibly fond of the man nicknamed Dizzy, a bond that can still be seen today.
As we pass into the inner entrance hall, your eye is drawn by this maquette, a plaster sculpture which show some of Queen Victoria's favourites. We've got her favourite pony, Flora. We've got her favourite collie, Sharp. And her favourite Highlander, Billy Connolly. No, John Brown. So in this single object, we have something that's very special for Victoria, and it's most appropriate and I think charming that it's this that she selected to present to Disraeli when he resigned as Prime Minister in 1880. It kind of encapsulates this special relationship. Victoria recorded her arrival at Hughenden in her diary, but she actually gave very, very little away. She wrote, "He met me at the door and led me into the library, which looked onto a pretty little Italian garden. We went out at once, and Beatrice and I each planted a tree." How green.
Despite appearances, Disraeli wasn't actually that wealthy. he didn't have many staff, so he had to take on additional personnel to make sure the Queen was properly catered for. Victoria was here for lunch, so with food historian Ivan Day, I'll be recreating a boozy dessert we know would have tickled the Prime Minister and his Queen's taste buds. The kitchen's no longer here, so we're cooking in the converted stables. Well, here we are at Hughenden, Ivan. Now, what are we going to be doing today?
Well, I've got a remarkable object to show you. It's a cake mould.
Oh, it's a cake mould?
Yeah, but it's specifically to make a Savoy cake, which is a giant sponge cake in this extraordinary architectural form. But we're going to do something with it. After we've baked it, we're going to turn it into a thing called a Tipsy cake, because we know that Disraeli was very fond of a tipple. What I've already done is I've greased the mould, drained it.
How interesting.
And while it's still warm, I've dusted it with a mixture of sugar and flour. Now that's to stop the cake from sticking.
To protect the cake from the heat of the oven, we wrap some paper around the mould and tie it in place. Now it's time to make the mixture.
The most essential ingredient are the eggs. So we've separated out 10 eggs. We need another 2. So, Rosemary, could you put the whites in there and the yolks in here? The other ingredients are very basic. We've got sugar and flour. Now, if you could start whipping those up, there's a wonderful Victorian bloom whisk there.
This is amazing. Look at that.
It's fantastic. You wait till you see it perform. It's really, really good.
We'll be whipping up our own cake mixture for this recipe, but in Victorian times, they often just used a stale Savoy cake. So, Ivan, this is done.
Well, I think we better get some into here. OK, that's brilliant. So what we do is we want to keep the air, so we just fold it in a little bit at a time. I want to introduce you to this wonderful piece of equipment. This is a Victorian flower sieve.
Ooh.
So if you put about half of the flour in there...
Well, I'm going to pour it over so it doesn't sort of...
That's perfect. Now what we do is if you turn it round, you can actually sieve it into...
Oh, this is amazing.
Isn't that great? It's wonderful.
I want one.
I knew you'd like that.
I love it.
Let's get all of that flour in. I think we've got to get that in the mould as quickly as you can. Would you be my guest?
Ooh, you're living dangerously.
There you go.
Fantastic. I'll just put the spoon over here. So,
right,
here we go.
aim right for the middle.
Yep, no problems. You know me.
Not too much at a time. Perfect. Just keep pouring it, Rosemary. We mustn't fill it right up. We just take it up to what they call the 3/4 level, which is about there, OK?
OK.
Great, perfect. That is absolutely perfect. There's only one thing we've got to do with that, you know.
Eat it.
No, we've got to bake it first.
While below stairs the staff were throwing together a spot of lunch, upstairs Disraeli and Victoria engaged in some pretty heavy issues.
That December day in 1877, Victoria was here on a mission. She was determined to stiffen Disraeli's political resolve and provide royal support at a time of international tension that was about to engulf Asia. She wrote in her diary, "I went back into the library where he gave me an account of yesterday's cabinet, which had been very stormy." And it's in this very room that the discussion took place.
You know, Her Madge had a history of meddling in policy issues that should have been a preserve of Parliament, and I have a copy of the telegram Disraeli sent to Victoria the day before she arrived here that recounts the stormy cabinet meeting and reveals just how involved she was.
You can see here, it says Foreign Office, 5:50 on December the 14th. And it says Cabinet, 2 hours, Carnarvon, Salisbury and Derby against, but the first 2 will, I think, assent. Decided on Monday. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Secretary for War and Lord Chancellor, excellent. And all the rest, on the whole, much pleased. So this just proves that Disraeli is keeping Victoria involved literally minute by minute with developments. All pretty unconstitutional.
Before we find out more about this political fuss, we first need to know more about Dizzy the Man, because by all accounts, he was a bit of a rascal. I've enlisted the help of historian Professor Jane Ridley.
Well, I think there's a huge difference between the young Disraeli, who was certainly a philanderer and a flatterer and a dandy and deeply in debt, and the old Disraeli, who is a dedicated statesman, incredibly hard-worked, a widower, but brilliantly manipulative and very good, particularly with women, which is, I think, where we come to Queen Victoria and the relationship with her. Disraeli treated her like not just a queen and not just a woman, but, you know, he called her the fairy queen.
The fairy queen, yes. And he was extravagant in his gestures, wasn't he? I mean, he would kiss her hand with a flourish and bow very deeply and significantly deeply, which would excite her as a
all
woman.
of this is quite true. And she, in exchange, gave him the privilege that no other Prime Minister had. She allowed him to sit down in her presence. Usually you had to stand if you were Prime Minister, but Dizzy was allowed to sit.
So there's a unique bond, possibly partly because Disraeli and Victoria had both been widowed by the time of this visit. And that special relationship had a major impact on Victoria.
Well, he did one terribly important thing, Disraeli. Queen Victoria, after Albert died, retired into seclusion. She was hardly seen, she was always dressed in black. And after about 10 years of this, there was a great deal of criticism. You know, the monarchy is supposed to be a public institution, and the Queen was invisible. And the person who really managed to sort of charm Victoria out of this was Disraeli. He was able to sort of persuade her to appear in public, to open Parliament. He was able to flatter her and tell her she was wonderful. And so, in a way, Disraeli saved the monarchy, you could argue. What he also did was to tell her much more than other prime ministers. He really let her into the secrets of politics, and of course she was fascinated. The more she knew, the more powerful she was politically. So he used her as a political ally.
Yes.
And you know, she used him to get what she wanted. I mean, for example, she badly wanted to be Empress of India. Disraeli did it for her.
And she, in return, made him Lord Beaconsfield.
Absolutely. It was a mutually reciprocal relationship.
As a widower, Lord Beaconsfield had to organise all the details of this royal visit himself. Janet Hilderley, who has written about Disraeli and his wife, is showing me around the cellar to give me an insight into what went on behind the scenes downstairs. So, Janet, what can you tell me about Queen Victoria's visit here?
He would have been amazed that she would have come here. They weren't old money. They were new, almost nouveau riche. They had no background, and they lived by their wits.
But this is what Disraeli really enjoyed, though. He enjoyed the high life.
Oh, indeed he did.
Yes.
And this is partly why he was £1 million in debt.
£1 million in debt? Really?
In our money today.
So what staff would they have had here for Victoria's visit?
Altogether, the house would have had about 30 people. But you would have had the butler, the housekeeper. He probably had to hire in footman, second footman, various maids, certainly a decent cook. So we're talking about probably 20 people.
So what about the silver? Would the silver have been kept in here?
Well, there wasn't very much silver. So he probably had to hire the silver in when the Queen came.
And actually this was really important to him because he wanted to impress Victoria so badly. Gosh, I can imagine all the things he was thinking of for this one visit.
What a nightmare. The poor bloke not only had to sort out the staff and the silver, he also had the small matter of sorting out the war in Turkey. Dizzy faced a difficult political dilemma, as Professor Jane Ridley explains.
Turkey had been invaded by Russia, and it was a kind of axiom of British foreign policy that you had to protect the route to India, and to do that you had to prop up Turkey, and to prop up Turkey you've got to keep the Russians behaving well. What Disraeli wants to do is to threaten war against Russia, because he thinks that if he does that, obviously the Russians will back down and come to terms.
But there's always the risk that having threatened the war, the Russians don't back down, and you're in it then, up to your neck, aren't you?
That was indeed the risk. And a lot of people in the cabinet thought precisely that. And so Disraeli's other problem is that his cabinet is split. And so it is on a knife edge, really, what's going to happen, whether we're going to have to go to war with Russia or whether Disraeli is going to have to back down with egg on his face and give up this whole policy. And the Queen wants to stiffen him. She's absolutely determined that these monstrous Russians must be taught a lesson. Get out of Turkey.
This was a sticky situation for Disraeli. He had the Queen barking in one ear, his cabinet howling in the other, and the last thing he wanted was to be seen as the lapdog of the monarch. Jane has this revealing copy of Disraeli's memo to the Queen, detailing the dramatic cabinet meeting the day before she came to Hughenden.
Lord Beaconsfield proposed that Your Majesty should be advised to summon Parliament immediately, that a considerable increase of Your Majesty's forces should be proposed, and that Your Majesty should simultaneously commence negotiations as mediator between the belligerents. This is really hot stuff. You know, he's saying that the Queen, by which he means the government, summon Parliament, send forces into Turkey, and also hopefully begin negotiations. Then Lord Derby spoke at length. Any active interference in Eastern affairs by England was to be deprecated. This is a really divided cabinet, and Lord Derby, you know, Foreign Secretary number 2 in the cabinet, is
a big gun.
Indeed, yeah.
The cabinet was adjourned after Victoria's visit, when the matter was to be decided, and not surprisingly, Victoria's backing paid off.
Disraeli got his way, and the Queen was delighted. Troops were ordered from India to Malta, 7,000 troops, and the fleet appeared outside the Dardanelles. The Russians were terrified. The Russians backed down and agreed to a conference, the Congress of Berlin. Disraeli went off as the British delegate, and he was triumphant. And he came back saying, "I have achieved peace with honour," the origin of that phrase.
You've got to hand it to Victoria. What she wants, she gets. And this visit was worth every minute of her time.
Let's hope our Tipsy cake does the business today. It's baked at a moderate heat for 50 minutes and left to stand so it's not too fragile to get out of the mould.
It's coming out nicely.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yes, I can
so
see.
what I'm going to do, the best way is to turn it out actually onto your hand. Whoops, it is hot. But how's that?
That looks wonderful.
Well, to make this tipsy cake really look good, the tradition was to cover it completely with an array of sliced almonds. So it ends up looking like a porcupine or a hedgehog. So very simply, we've just got to make some little knife wounds and then select a really good almond, make sure it's a whole one, and then just push it in like that. And I think we'll probably need a few hundred to finish that off.
We know Victoria liked a slice of cake with her afternoon tea. After all, the Victoria sponge was named after her. So the pressure's on to get this just right.
Victoria was only here at Hughenden for a few hours on that December day, but her friendship with Disraeli lasted for years, mementos of which are everywhere.
Of all the books in the library, there's one that we're pretty certain Disraeli would have had prominently on display, and that's this. What's so special about this book? Well, look at the title. It's entitled Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands, which is a book that Victoria actually wrote and had published. And what's special about this one is the inscription on the flyleaf. Look at that. It says, "To the Right Honourable B. Disraeli, in recollection of Balmoral, September 1868. Disraeli was Prime Minister. He would have gone to the Highlands to visit the Queen, and she presented him with this book, and actually signed it book. Victoria R. R."
It seems Disraeli could do no wrong in Victoria's eyes. In fact, when you see some of these presents, you might be forgiven for thinking they were more than just good friends.
Most extraordinary of all, as a gift, I think, is this wash set, a Renaissance-style jug and basin set. But look at the handle. A positively pornographic-looking woman reclining on the top. It's easy to imagine that with every gift that she gave him, he felt more and more secure in the heart of the British establishment, a position he'd craved all his life. No greater gift, perhaps, than when she made him a peer. And here, in his peer's robes, he would have felt, well, I don't know, completely chuffed. Who wouldn't?
Well, I have to say, I'm pretty chuffed as well, because our Victorian dessert is starting to take shape, ready for our royal lunch, ready for Lord Wonnacott of Eat-A-Lot. And now for the bit I've been looking forward to all day, adding the booze.
I've got some larding pins in here because we're always instructed to make lots of holes in the cake so that the sherry, which we're going to pour onto it, can work its way down to the bottoms. Do you know, I think it's time to turn it into a tipsy cake. So a little bit at a time. You just pour it into the top.
Are you going to trust me,
I
Ivan?
always trust you. Come on, just pour it in.
Today we're using cherry, but in Victorian times, whiskey, port wine or brandy was just as popular.
Just keep pouring it. That's wonderful. Maybe a little bit lower down as well.
Around the sides.
Perfect. Never mind tipsy. I think this cake is completely blotto, actually, so I wouldn't put any more sherry on it. Right, now, you finished off a tipsy cake with a very, very simple milk and egg yolk custard.
Lovely. And you just pour it over?
Well, I personally feel it's much nicer if it's just around the base. So if you just pour it up to about that level there, go around nice and neatly, so make a little pool of custard all the way around it. And you get a bit more
look at the alcohol as well.
Yeah, you get a little bit more custard in a sauce boat as well to pour over it. I think it looks much nicer without. That's perfect.
That looks wonderful.
Some tipsy cake.
Some tipsy cake.
Do you think Tim's going to enjoy that?
I think Tim is going to absolutely love it.
Well, you know what they say about the proof and the pudding, Rosemary? But before our lunch date, I'm heading off just down the hill from Hughenden to the local church, St Michael's and All Angels. This is the final resting place of Benjamin Disraeli, who died in 1881, 4 years after this visit. Victoria was so devastated by his death that she insisted on creating a memorial inside the church. It's another insight into the depth of feeling she had for her Prime Minister.
And this is the stall that Disraeli occupied when he came to church. But interestingly, hanging on the wall above him is the regalia relating to his Order of the Garter, and way up above that, the associated banner. And these things were brought and placed here expressly at the wish of Victoria. Next door to the regalia is his memorial tablet, exquisitely carved in Carrara marble and erected by Victoria in remembrance of him, and is the only memorial tablet erected by a reigning sovereign in a parish church for a subject anywhere in Britain. So that's quite something.
Disraeli left instructions in his will for a private, not state funeral here in his local parish. Now, convention dictates that the monarch can't go to the funeral of a commoner, and although he'd been made a lord, Disraeli was still a commoner, so Victoria couldn't attend. But a rumour persists that she came and sat in her carriage in the valley below while Disraeli was buried.
What we do know is that Victoria returned to Hughenden in person 4 days after the funeral. She writes in her diary, "The flowers still remained as at the funeral. Then we walked around to the tomb, which had been opened purposefully for me to see it. There, in a small place, is dear Lord Beaconsfield's coffin, covered with wreaths and flowers, next to his wife's. And there are others also of his family buried there. Could hardly realise it at all. It seemed so sad and cheerless. I placed a wreath of china flowers. Now the vault is to be closed and not used again."
Interestingly, Victoria omits to mention another lady buried alongside Disraeli. The burial plot thickens.
It says, "In memory of Sarah Bridges Williams." What is Sarah Bridges Williams doing buried next door to Disraeli and his wife? Well, she was an extraordinary Jewess from the West Country who befriended Disraeli and insisted that if he would become her executor and allow her to be buried next door to him, then she would give him her entire estate. which is exactly what came about. Because when she died in 1863, she was indeed interred here. And Disraeli, the cunning old fox, picked up £30,000 from her estate.
What's even more astonishing is that Disraeli's wife, who was alive at the time, went along with it. Who says money can't buy love, eh? Foxy or not, Disraeli left a huge hole in Victoria's heart. It would seem the most important men in her life were those she sadly lost. First her beloved Albert 20 years earlier, and now Disraeli. After a visit to the church, she came back to the house to pay her final respects.
The epilogue to Victoria's relationship with Disraeli is really rather sad. She came into this, his room, alone to contemplate his life. This room is one of the least changed at Hughenden, as evidenced by photographs taken in 1880. On the desk, we've got the dried remains of 2 posies of primroses, Disraeli's favourite flower, which the Queen had especially sent from Osborne on the day of the funeral, together with an affectionate note. When she was in this room, perhaps Victoria sat in this very chair, contemplating the desk that Disraeli had used as a schoolboy and maybe looking at the red dispatch box. So very many memories, and so very, very sad.
Well, I think it's only fitting that we pay homage to this beautiful friendship with a treat we know both the fairy princess and Dizzy would have loved. Time to present our own premiere with our magnificent Tipsy cake.
Well, Rosemary, all this gloom and doom today has made me rather peckish. What have you got here?
Well, I'm very glad because I want you to enjoy this. This is called a Tipsy cake.
Ah.
Now, it is a Savoy cake cooked with something poured over it. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is just give you a taste.
Oh, yes, please.
Yes, give me your plate and I'll do it from this side. 'Cause
Lovely.
It's easier. It is very soft.
Yes.
Moist. And I'm going to pour a little bit of custard over the top. Let's dig in and see if
Lovely.
you like it.
I think it's just as well I'm not driving my car today, because is it really alco-pop, this, isn't it?
It is so alcoholic. We've got about a pint of sherry in there.
Have we?
And I must tell you, it is just amazing. It soaks it up.
Well, that's marvellous, isn't it? Who?
Why don't we do a toast to Benjamin Disraeli and Queen Victoria?
I'm with you. Cheerio.
Next time on Royal Upstairs Downstairs, we're another 13 years on in Victoria's Royal Roadshow. The year is 1890 and the Queen has a lunch date at Hughenden Manor in Buckinghamshire.
But it was no ordinary date. This was an extremely rare public appearance for a now elderly and reclusive queen who was about to celebrate her 71st birthday.